The blood-stained military ID hit the ER floor at 7:42 in the morning, spinning once before stopping face up under the fluorescent lights. Nobody picked it up. Nobody had time. Outside, 4 armored vehicles rolled into a slow circle around Riverside Medical Center, their engines a low grinding rumble that rattled the windows on the ground floor. Inside, in the main corridor near the administrative wing, a 29-year-old nurse named Olivia Hart was being told, in front of 12 colleagues, that she was finished, that her career was over, that she had 1 hour to clear her locker and surrender her badge. She didn't argue. She didn't cry. She lowered her eyes, turned, and walked toward the exit like someone who had learned, a long time ago, how to disappear quietly. Nobody in that hallway knew what she had done before she became a nurse. Nobody knew what was coming. If this story already has you hooked, stay with me until the very end. Hit that subscribe button, give this video a like, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Let's go. Port Sterling was the kind of city that looked better from the highway than it did up close. The waterfront had been renovated twice in the last decade. New pavement, new lampposts, murals painted over the old brick. But the neighborhoods behind the medical district still had the tired look of a place that had been promised things and then quietly forgotten. Riverside Medical Center sat near the center of it all, an 11-story building that called itself a regional hub and had the billing rates to match. Though anyone who worked there more than 6 months could tell you the staffing numbers didn't add up and hadn't for years. Olivia Hart had worked there for 2 years and 4 months. She knew the building's rhythms the way she knew her own, which elevators were slow, which supply closets were always unlocked, which attending physicians showed up late on Tuesdays, which nurses were covering double shifts because the floor was perpetually understaffed. She had learned to work inside all of it without complaint. That had been a choice, and not always an easy one. She arrived at 6:15 that Wednesday morning, which was her usual time, and signed in at the third-floor nursing station before checking the overnight board. 3 patients had been transferred out, 1 had been upgraded to stable, and 1, room 318, a 57-year-old man named Gerald Pruitt, who had come in 2 nights ago with a cardiac event, was flagged for a medication review. Olivia looked at the flag, looked at the chart, and felt something shift quietly in her chest. The dosage on the overnight order was wrong. Not dramatically, not dangerously wrong in a way that would have triggered the automated pharmacy alert, but wrong in the way that took some actual clinical knowledge to catch. A combination of 2 drugs that, at the levels listed, would have created a mild but measurable interaction over the next 12 hours. Not fatal, probably not even noticed, but wrong. She checked the name on the order. Dr. Harlan Voss, Chief Medical Officer, whose signature appeared at the bottom in the loose automatic scrawl of someone who signed things without reading them closely. Voss had been at Riverside for 9 years. He had a corner office on the 8th floor, a parking spot with his name on it, and a habit of making decisions from a distance and letting the floor staff absorb the consequences. Olivia flagged the order, documented the concern in the chart, and went to find the charge nurse. She wasn't looking for a confrontation. She was doing her job. What happened in the next 40 minutes was the kind of institutional unraveling that Olivia had seen before, in different forms, in different places. The reflexive closing of ranks, the rapid reinterpretation of events to protect the person with the most leverage. By 7 o'clock, the story being circulated was that Olivia had overridden a physician's order without authorization. By 7:15, someone had called the office of Richard Calvert, Riverside's executive director of operations, and by 7:30, Calvert himself was on the 3rd floor with his assistant and 2 members of hospital security, moving with the confident energy of a man who had already decided how this was going to go. Calvert was 53, broad-shouldered, with a quality of absolute certainty that some people mistook for intelligence. He had come up through hospital administration in a different city, under different circumstances, and had arrived at Riverside 4 years ago with a mandate from the board to tighten operations and improve profitability metrics. He had done that in the way that people like Calvert usually did, by cutting where it was hard to see, by rerouting accountability downward, by being very careful about which facts made it into which reports. He found Olivia at the nursing station writing her documentation. "Miss Hart." He didn't say her name like a greeting. She looked up. He laid a folder on the counter between them. I need you to come with me. The corridor outside was not empty. There were nurses, an aide, an orderly with a linen cart, a family member who had wandered in looking for a vending machine. They all had the slightly tightened posture of people who were pretending not to listen. Calvert didn't seem to notice or didn't care. It's come to my attention that you altered a physician's medication order this morning without authorization. That's a serious protocol violation. There's also a prior incident from last month involving patient documentation on the 4th floor. Olivia's voice was even. I flagged a dosage concern through proper channels. The order was not altered, and the incident last month was documented and reviewed. Our review reached a different conclusion. He said it like that settled it. I've spoken with Dr. Voss. I've spoken with HR. Effective immediately, your access to patient areas is suspended pending investigation, and you are being placed on administrative leave without pay. He slid the folder toward her. This outlines the process. She didn't reach for it. You're welcome to review the documentation with an HR representative, he said, but I'd ask that you gather your personal items and exit the building within the hour. Security will escort you. It was the last part that was intended to land hardest. The escort, the public accounting of her departure. Calvert understood, the way people like him always understood, that the real punishment wasn't the administrative leave. It was the performance of her removal, staged in a corridor where people could see it. Olivia looked at him for a moment, not with hostility, with something more careful and harder to read. I understand, she said. She closed the patient chart she had been working on. She put her pen in her pocket. She pushed back her chair and stood, and she followed the 2 security guards down the corridor toward the elevator, and the only sound was the soft squeak of her shoes on the linoleum and the low mechanical hum of the building around her. 12 people watched her go. Not one of them said anything. The locker room on the basement level was empty at that hour. Olivia moved through it without hurrying, which was the only way she knew how to move when things went wrong. Not faster, not louder, just steadily, as if speed and noise were luxuries she'd stopped being able to afford at some point she couldn't exactly identify. She opened her locker, took out a canvas bag, and began putting things into it. A spare pair of scrubs, a water bottle, a small photograph that she kept face down most of the time, 3 figures in desert pattern camo, squinting into a sun that was somewhere off to the left of the frame. She looked at it for a second before she put it in the bag. Then she sat down on the bench, which was something she wouldn't have done in a different building, in a different time of her life. Sitting when there was still something that needed doing had felt once like a failure, like a gap in her attention that could get someone killed. She'd had to learn, slowly and not very gracefully, to let herself stop. She sat there for maybe 2 minutes. Then her phone buzzed. A text from a number she didn't recognize. They're clearing the industrial park on Route 9. Something went wrong at the Halcott plant. Bad. She didn't know who sent it. She put her phone in her bag and stood. On the 4th floor of the same building, in a conference room with a glass wall overlooking the main atrium, Richard Calvert was on a call. His assistant, a young man named Marcus, who had been with him for 18 months and had learned to read his moods with the accuracy of a barometer, was standing near the door with a tablet, ready. It's handled, Calvert said into the phone. The nurse is out. Voss is fine. We run the corrected narrative through the incident report, and it's a non-story. A pause. I understand the timing. I'm telling you it's handled. Another pause, shorter. The Halcott review is on the board agenda for Thursday. We push it to next month and let the inspectors cycle out. It's not complicated. He ended the call. He looked at Marcus. Get me the compliance file for Halcott distribution. Marcus was already pulling it up. Sir, there's something... The building shook. Not dramatically, not like an earthquake, but enough. A single low concussive thud that moved through the floor and up through the walls and rattled the windows in their frames. The water in Calvert's coffee cup made a small wave. Somewhere in the atrium below, someone shouted. Calvert stood, went to the window, looked south toward the industrial corridor along Route 9. The smoke was already rising. A column of it, dark gray turning to black at the edges, climbing fast above the city's low skyline. Pom. The first ambulance arrived at Riverside's emergency bay 9 minutes after the explosion. Then 2 more. Then a fire department vehicle. Then a city bus that had been pressed into service as a transport, its windows cracked its emergency door propped open with someone's jacket. The ER charge nurse, a veteran named Dennis Falk, who had worked at Riverside for 11 years and had seen bad days before, called the trauma team and then called the floor coordinators, and then called the attending on duty, Dr. Patricia Morrow, who was already running down the stairs from the second floor when her phone rang. He called the OR, and he called the blood bank, and he did all of this in about 90 seconds while simultaneously directing the incoming gurneys toward the trauma bays. And by the time the fourth ambulance pulled in, the ER was already past its comfortable capacity and building toward something that Falk, who did not use dramatic language, was privately categorizing as a disaster. 12 casualties in the first wave: burns, blast trauma, crush injuries, inhalation damage. 3 were critical. 1 was a child, maybe 9 years old, who had been near the plant's east fence when the primary storage unit detonated, and who was now arriving on a gurney with a firefighter holding pressure on a wound that nobody had had time to properly assess. Morrow was a competent physician. She was also a physician who had practiced at a mid-sized regional hospital for most of her career, whose experience with mass casualty events was largely theoretical, and who was now standing in a trauma bay with 3 critical patients, an understaffed floor, and a nursing team that was doing everything right but was visibly overwhelmed. "We need to triage the secondary bay," she said. Where's the triage lead?" "Covering bay 2, someone said. "I need someone in 4. Who's available?" Silence. Not the dramatic silence of people refusing, the silence of a room where everyone was already doing 2 things and knew they couldn't do 3. Outside, beyond the ambulance bay's sliding doors, Olivia Hart was standing with her canvas bag over one shoulder, watching. She had come around from the employee exit, intending to cross the parking lot to the bus stop. She had watched the first ambulance come in, then the second. She had done the math the way she'd been trained to do math, not with a calculator, but with a particular kind of attention that took in the number of gurneys, the posture of the medics, the pace at which people were moving, and the spaces where people weren't moving but should have been. She saw the gap. The secondary triage area near Bay 4, the bay closest to the loading dock. Nobody was there. She stood at the doors for 3 seconds. Then she pushed them open and walked back in. Nobody stopped her immediately because, in the controlled chaos of an incoming mass casualty, the fact of someone moving with purpose and direction registers faster than the question of whether they're supposed to be there. Olivia had counted on exactly that. It wasn't calculation. It was something older and more automatic. The part of her that had learned how to enter a space and occupy it before anyone had the chance to think about whether she belonged. She dropped her bag behind the nurse's station at Bay 4. She found a set of gloves. She found the supply cart. The first patient they brought her was a man in his 40s, a plant worker named, his tag said, Dwight Sauer. Blast trauma to the left side, partial burns on his forearm, responsive but disoriented. She assessed him in 40 seconds. She started fluids. She called out to the nearest aide for a secondary IV line and got it in his other arm before the aide had fully processed what she was asking. Dwight looked up at her from the gurney. Is it bad?" "You're okay," she said. "Left arm's going to hurt for a while. You're going to be fine." She said it in the specific tone of voice that she had used, in different settings, in different languages, on different kinds of tables and makeshift stretchers. That was not reassuring in the soft sense, but in the factual sense. I have assessed this, and I'm telling you accurately what is happening. The second patient was a woman with a penetrating wound to the lower right abdomen from shrapnel. Olivia looked at the entry point, checked her pressure, flagged her immediately for surgical. Third patient, inhalation injury. Fourth, blast concussion, responsive. Fifth, the child. The child arrived in Bay 4 because the main trauma bays were full and the decision about routing had been made fast and not perfectly. He was conscious, which was something, but the wound on his left leg was more serious than the initial assessment had suggested, and Olivia looked at it and recognized immediately what was happening. A vascular involvement, not severe, not immediately life-threatening, but the kind of thing that became life-threatening if you waited another 20 minutes. She called toward the corridor. "I need a vascular consult in 4 now. Pediatric patient, 7 to 9 years, suspected femoral involvement." A voice she didn't recognize. Who's calling that?" "Bay 4. Get me a vascular consult." A pause. Then Dennis Falk appeared in the doorway. He looked at Olivia. He looked at the room. 2 patients being treated, 2 more being assessed. The child on the table with Olivia's hand steady on his leg and her voice calm, and her demeanor so completely inconsistent with the chaos in the rest of the building that Falk, who had seen a lot of things, had to take a second to process it. "Hart," he said, You're not supposed to be here." "I know." She didn't look away from the child. "Get me vascular." Falk looked at the kid, looked at what Olivia was doing. He was an 11-year veteran, and he knew what competent care looked like. And what he was seeing was not a nurse doing her best under pressure. It was something categorically different. He got on his radio. In the administrative wing, 2 floors up, Richard Calvert was receiving updates that he did not want. The ER was overwhelmed. 3 critical patients. A child. The city's emergency management coordinator had called wanting to know what Riverside's surge capacity was, and Calvert's answer, which he had given through clenched teeth, was that they were handling it. The media van that had been parked outside for what he'd assumed was a routine story about the hospital's expansion project was now pointing its cameras at the ambulance bay. His phone rang. It was the board chair, a woman named Sylvia Hartwell, who did not call unless she had already decided something. "I'm getting calls about the Halcott explosion," she said. "I'm told some of the survivors are at Riverside. We're managing the intake. It's a mass casualty scenario, Sylvia, and the team is... I'm also told there are workers who are saying the explosion was caused by faulty pressure systems that failed a safety inspection last year. An inspection that Halcott Distribution contracted through a third-party firm." A pause. "I'm looking at a document right now, Richard. It has Riverside's Compliance Division's name on it." Calvert said nothing. "I'd like you to come explain this to me," Hartwell said. "In person. Tonight." The call ended. Calvert set the phone down on his desk and stood very still for a moment, the way a man stands when he is doing rapid, private math and does not like the answer he keeps arriving at. From somewhere below, distant but distinct, he heard something new, a sound that the building had not made before, a rhythmic, heavy thudding that came from outside and grew louder. Marcus appeared in the doorway, his face doing something uncertain. "Sir, there are military helicopters. They came in low over the waterfront, 2 UH-72s and a larger CH-47 moving in from the south, the kind of formation that didn't suggest routine transport. They circled the medical center once, then the CH-47 set down in the parking structure's upper deck, which was the only flat surface large enough to take it, and the 2 smaller aircraft landed in the adjacent emergency services lot where the paramedic units had been staging. The people who came off those aircraft were not what most people imagined when they thought of the military showing up at a hospital. They were not aggressive. They did not storm anything. They moved with the brisk, economical efficiency of professionals who had done logistical operations in complicated environments and understood that the fastest way through most situations was not force, but clarity. The commanding officer was a man named Major Elliot Braun, 41, compact and unremarkable looking in the way of people whose unremarkableness is a function of enormous competence. Nothing wasted, nothing performed. He came through the emergency services entrance with 2 of his team members, presented credentials to the first staff member he encountered, and asked a single question. "I need to know where Olivia Hart is." The staff member, a registration clerk named Phoebe, who had been having a genuinely terrible morning, looked at him. I think she was... There was a situation earlier. She was asked to leave. Is she still in the building?" "I don't know. I think maybe in the ER." Braun nodded once and turned toward the ER corridor. In Bay 4, Olivia was in the middle of her 11th patient when she heard the shift in the building's energy. It was hard to explain precisely. A change in the way people were moving in the corridor, a new quality to the ambient noise. She had felt it before, in places where the arrival of a particular kind of authority recalibrated everything around it. She finished what she was doing before she looked up. Braun appeared in the doorway of Bay 4. He saw her, hand still gloved, a patient on the table, Three nurses and an aide working alongside her in the focused, almost wordless rhythm of people who had gotten past the question of who was in charge. He stood there for a moment. Olivia peeled off one glove to check her patient's pulse. His pressure's steadying, she said to the nurse beside her. Keep the fluids going. If it drops again, get Morrow in here. She pulled off the other glove, dropped them both, and turned to face Braun. They looked at each other across the room. Sergeant Hart, he said. It was not a question, and it had been a long time since anyone had called her that. Major, she said quietly. Behind them, in the corridor, someone's radio crackled with an update. Dennis Falk appeared again at the far end of the hallway. Two of Braun's personnel were behind him. Three nurses at the nearby station had stopped what they were doing to watch. Braun took 3 steps into the room and stopped. He didn't speak immediately. He had the look of a man who had been searching for something for longer than he'd expected to and was now recalibrating what came next. We heard about the explosion, he said. We were already in the region. A beat. We need you. Olivia looked past him, at the hallway, at the nurses watching, at Dennis Falk's face doing something she couldn't quite categorize. Surprise or recognition, or some version of both. I was fired this morning, she said. I know. The hospital's executive director suspended my access. I know that too. Braun's voice didn't change. Olivia, there are 37 more casualties coming in from the secondary structure at Halcott. Firefighters just pulled them out. They'll be here in 14 minutes. The bay was silent for a moment. The monitor beside her patient beeped steadily. Olivia turned back to the room, back to the nurses, back to the work that was already there. Get me the OR schedule, she said, and tell Dr. Morrow I need to talk to her right now. Nobody moved for exactly 1 second. Then everyone moved. In his office, 2 floors above, Richard Calvert's assistant opened the door without knocking, which was something he had never done in 18 months of employment. Sir, Marcus said, the military is in the ER, and I think... He stopped, swallowed. I think they came here specifically for the nurse you fired this morning. Calvert looked at him. The building shook again, not from an explosion this time, but from the rotors of the second helicopter making its approach, close enough now to vibrate the glass in its frame. Outside, through the window, Calvert could see the parking structure's upper deck lit up with landing lights, and the shapes of people moving in organized patterns, and below all of that, the first vehicles from the second wave of casualties turning into the hospital drive. He looked at the compliance file still open on his desk, at the name of the third-party inspection firm, at the dates. He closed the folder, and the door to his office opened again. Not Marcus this time, but a woman in a dark jacket with a federal identification badge clipped to her lapel, and behind her, 2 more. Mr. Calvert, she said, I'm Special Agent Dana Reyes, Office of Inspector General. We're going to need your full cooperation this afternoon. He did not offer her his hand. And Special Agent Reyes did not seem to expect him to. She moved past the threshold with the calm of someone executing a plan that had been set in motion well before this moment, and her 2 colleagues fanned out with the practiced efficiency of people who had done this kind of entry enough times that it had stopped feeling like anything at all. Calvert stood behind his desk. He was not technically under arrest. Nobody had said that word, but the physics of the room had shifted in a way that made certain movements, toward the door, toward his phone, toward the compliance folder, feel inadvisable. I'd like to call my attorney, he said. Absolutely, Reyes said. She pulled out a chair on the visitor's side of his desk and sat down. We're not going anywhere. 2 floors below, Olivia didn't know any of that was happening. She didn't have the bandwidth for what was happening on the 8th floor. She had 14 minutes, now 12, before the second wave arrived, and she was using every one of them. Dr. Patricia Morrow met her in the corridor outside Bay 4. Morrow was 51, with cropped gray hair and the faintly compressed expression of a physician who had been managing too much for too long. She looked at Olivia the way people sometimes look at a problem they haven't finished solving yet. You were suspended, Morrow said. Yes, and yet you're still here. There's a child in 4 who needed vascular assessment, and your team was at capacity. Olivia kept her voice level, not defensive, just precise. And there are 37 more casualties coming in from Halcott's secondary structure. Firefighters pulled them out about 8 minutes ago. They'll hit your bay in under 10 minutes, and you're already running 2 trauma teams in 6 bays. Morrow looked at her for a moment. Then she looked past her, at the bay, at the 2 patients being monitored, at the aide who had started restocking the supply cart with the automatic efficiency of someone following Olivia's prior instructions without being asked twice. "What's your assessment of current capacity?" Morrow asked. It wasn't exactly an invitation. It wasn't a rescinding of the suspension. It was a physician standing in front of a crisis, asking the most useful question available to her. "Bay 4 can take 3 more critical," Olivia said. "Bay 6 is closest to OR access. You want your penetrating trauma and vascular cases routing through there. Pull Dr. Fenwick from the second-floor consult list. He's your best hands for blast injuries, and he's been up there doing routine intake for the last 40 minutes. Morrow's eyebrows moved slightly. "How do you know Fenwick's schedule?" "I've worked here for 2 years. A beat." "Fine," Morrow said. She turned and started walking. "Stay in 4. Don't go near admin, and for the record, this conversation didn't happen." "Understood." Major Braun had positioned his 2 team members at the ER entrance and was now standing just inside Bay 4, near enough to observe without being in the way. He had done enough forward operating to know when to stay out of someone's space and what he was watching. Olivia moving through the room with the specific, unhurried efficiency of someone who had triaged casualties in conditions far worse than this, told him everything he needed about whether she could still do the job. She knew he was there. She'd acknowledged him once, briefly, when she crossed the room to check a monitor. Just a glance. The kind that said, "I see you, I'm not ignoring you. We'll talk when there's a window." There wasn't a window yet. The second wave arrived in 11.5 minutes, which was 30 seconds ahead of the estimate, and they came in fast. 2 ambulances, a fire department transport, and a city utility truck that had been pressed into service because there weren't enough ambulances left. 34 patients, not 37. The count had been revised in transit when 3 were diverted to Port Sterling General on the other side of the district. Still, 34. Burns, blast concussion, structural crush injuries. A man who had lost 2 fingers on his right hand and was somehow still conscious enough to be agitated about it. A woman who had been near the administrative trailer when the secondary structure came down and had taken a concrete fragment to the upper left chest. The woman in the chest was named Harriet Voss. She was 63, with gray hair and reading glasses still somehow attached to the front of her shirt, and she was conscious, but her breathing had the shallow, asymmetric quality that Olivia recognized before the paramedic had finished his handoff. Left tension pneumo developing. The paramedic's assessment had flagged shortness of breath and chest pain, which was accurate but incomplete. Olivia looked at Dennis Falk, who had stayed on the floor and was coordinating between bays. "I need a needle thoracostomy kit in 4. Now." Falk moved. One of the nurses, a young man named Garrett Solis, who had been at Riverside for 8 months, and was, until this morning, one of the nurses who had watched Olivia's departure from the 3rd-floor corridor, with the mute, slightly uncomfortable expression of someone who knows something is wrong, but isn't sure it's their call to say so, came around the curtain with the kit. He handed it to her. She looked at him for exactly 1 second, which was 1 second she didn't have, and then she looked back at the patient. "Okay, Harriet," she said, "I need you to hold very still for me." "What are you doing?" Harriet managed. It came out fragmented, between breaths. "I'm going to help your lung. It'll be uncomfortable for about 4 seconds, and then it's going to get easier to breathe. Okay?" Harriet made a sound that was not quite yes, but also not no, and Olivia worked. She had done this procedure in a field hospital outside Rashidabad with a kit that was 2 weeks past its sterile date and a patient who had been screaming. She had done it on a transport helicopter in low visibility with the aircraft moving. She had done it in the back of a vehicle that was not a medical vehicle and was not supposed to stop. She did it now, in a clean bay with good lighting and a full team around her, and it took her 38 seconds from positioning to placement. Harriet Voss took a breath that was visibly different from the ones before it. "There," Olivia said. Garrett Solis was staring at her. She noticed. She didn't say anything about it. "Get her pressure in 2 minutes," she told him, "and find out if Dr. Morrow wants her in ORQ now or after stabilization." He nodded and turned and almost walked into Major Braun, who had moved just inside the curtain without either of them noticing. Braun watched Garrett go. Then he looked at Olivia, who was already stripping her gloves again, already moving to the next station. "You're going to have to tell me why," she said, without turning around. "Why what?" "Why you came here. Specifically." She found a new pair of gloves. "You said you were in the region, but the OIG showed up at the same time, which means this wasn't just a routing decision." A pause. "We can talk about that when—" "Tell me the short version," she said, "because at some point in the next hour, someone from administration is going to come down here and try to remove me again. And if there's something I need to know before that happens, I'd rather know it now." Braun considered that for a moment. He had the quality of someone who was used to being in charge of information and was making a quick calculation about what releasing some of it would cost. "Halcott Distribution," he said. "The facility that exploded this morning. There's a federal contractor connection. Certain materials stored at that site were under a DoD logistics contract. When we got the alert that the facility went up, we were dispatched to assess exposure and support civilian response." He stopped. "That's still not why you asked for me by name," Olivia said. "No," he said. "It's not." She turned around and looked at him. "We'll talk," he said. "I promise. But I need you functional for the next 2 hours, and telling you the rest of it right now is going to make that harder." She held his gaze for a moment. Something passed across her expression. Not quite irritation, not quite resignation. Something more like the recognition of a particular kind of delay she had learned to accept in situations where the information hierarchy wasn't going to bend to her schedule. "Fine," she said. She went back to work. On the 8th floor, Richard Calvert's attorney had arrived by phone. The attorney's name was Donahue, and he was the kind of attorney who was very good at the specific function of making space between a client and a charging document, and he was currently doing that function at high speed while Calvert sat across from Special Agent Reyes and said very little. Reyes was patient. She had a folder in front of her that she had not yet opened. She had a colleague sitting quietly to her left who had not spoken since they entered the room. She had been in this kind of room before. "Mr. Calvert," she said eventually, "I want to be clear about what we're doing here. We're not here because of this morning's termination of a nurse. We're here because of a federal inspection report filed in March of last year under a compliance contract between Riverside Medical's Administrative Division and Halcott Distribution Services. Specifically a report that appears to have been modified before submission." Calvert said nothing. "The explosion this morning killed 2 people," Reyes said. 3 more are in critical condition downstairs. The preliminary fire investigation suggests a pressure system failure that the March inspection was specifically designed to assess. She opened the folder, turned it so he could see the first page. "That's your signature on the sign-off." It was. "I want my attorney present in person," Calvert said. "Mr. Donahue is on his way. In the meantime, I'm happy to wait." She closed the folder. "I've got time, but..." Downstairs, the ER had found a rhythm. Not comfort. There was no comfort in a mass casualty event. Not really. Not at the level of the individual human beings on the gurneys and the individual human beings working over them, but the specific operational rhythm that emerges when a team moves past the initial crisis response and settles into the sustained effort. Bays were turning over. Patients were moving toward OR, toward imaging, toward the floor upstairs. The flow had slowed from the pressure burst of the first 90 minutes to something more manageable. Olivia noticed the shift. She had always been good at noticing shifts, in atmospheric pressure, in team energy, in the moment a situation went from acute to stable. It was a useful skill and also, sometimes, a lonely one, because it meant she was frequently in a different part of the operational picture than the people around her. She finished her assessment on a 17-year-old who had been at Halcott for a summer internship. A kid named Jorge, who had a concussion and 2 fractured fingers, and whose parents had arrived in the waiting room and were being attended to by a social worker. And she stepped out of the bay into the corridor and leaned against the wall and let herself breathe for a minute. It had been a long time since she'd worked a mass casualty intake. The physical memory of it was different from the cognitive memory. Her hands knew before her brain did what to do and in what order, and that was a gift she'd never taken lightly. But it also meant that afterward, when the immediate imperative released, there was a particular kind of fatigue that settled in behind the eyes and at the base of the neck that had nothing to do with physical exertion. Garrett Solis came out of Bay 3 and stopped when he saw her. He looked like he wanted to say something. He did not immediately say it. "What?" she said. "Nothing." He shifted. That procedure earlier. The chest. I've seen that done in the simulation lab. I've never seen anyone do it like that." She looked at him. "Like what?" she said. "Like it was... I don't know." He seemed to understand he was not quite saying what he meant. "Like it was just obvious. Like you'd done it 100 times." "I have," she said. He absorbed that. "Where?" She studied him for a moment. He was young, probably 26, 27. He'd been one of the people in the corridor that morning. She'd seen his face. She hadn't cataloged any particular cruelty in it, just the ordinary discomfort of someone witnessing something he didn't want to be part of, but also wasn't going to intervene in. "Different place," she said. "Different context." He nodded like that answered the question, even though it didn't, and then he went back into the bay. She was still leaning against the wall when Dennis Falk appeared from the direction of the nurse's station with his tablet and the expression of someone carrying information he wasn't sure how to deliver. "Calvert's in his office," he said. "Or was. Federal agents are up there. Someone said there are 2 more vehicles in the back lot." He paused. "Is that connected to—" "Probably," she said. "What the hell did you do, Hart?" She almost laughed. It came out as something less than a laugh, but more than a breath. Something that surprised her slightly. "I flagged a medication order," she said. "That's what I did." "This morning, sure. I mean, before here." He gestured vaguely upward toward the helicopters that were no longer in the air, but whose presence lingered in the building's energy, like the after effect of a loud sound. "Because military majors don't show up personally for nurses they don't know." "No," she said. "They don't." Falk waited. He was not an impatient man. "I did some things before nursing school," she said. "Field medicine, overseas. It's complicated," he said. Major Braun came around the corner from the direction of the ER entrance. He had his phone in one hand and was reading something on the screen with the focused attention of someone receiving information that had operational significance. He looked up when he saw them. "We need to talk," he said. "Now, if possible." Falk looked at Olivia. She looked at Braun. Then she pushed herself off the wall. "Conference room," Falk said. "End of the hallway. It's small and it smells like burned coffee, but nobody will bother you." The conference room was small and smelled like burned coffee. Braun's 2 team members stayed outside. It was just the 2 of them at the table, and for a moment neither of them spoke, which was the kind of silence that held the weight of things that had been building toward being said for longer than this morning. Braun set his phone face down on the table. "How much do you know about the Halcott connection?" he asked. "As of about an hour ago, nothing. Now I know there's a DoD logistics contract and some kind of inspection irregularity that has the OIG interested." She paused. "And Calvert's name is on a sign-off." "There's more." He leaned forward slightly. "The materials at Halcott weren't just stored under a DoD contract. They were part of a secondary logistics chain that traces back to a procurement network we've been tracking for about 16 months. Falsified inspection reports were one component. The reports cleared certain facilities for continued operation that should have been flagged." He stopped. "Riverside's compliance division was the certifying body on 4 of those inspections." Olivia was quiet for a moment. "4, she said. "Halcott was the most recent. 2 of the others had minor incidents. The 4th is a fuel depot outside Marin County that we haven't fully assessed yet." He looked at her. "The reason I asked for you by name is that your name came up in the documentation." The room felt very still. "Explain that," she said. 16 months ago, when you were still at Fort Delmore, you filed an incident report about a supply chain irregularity, a discrepancy in material transfer logs for a forward logistics base in the 3rd Theater. The report was routed to a JAG officer and then," he paused, "reclassified, buried. But it didn't disappear. When our investigative team started pulling threads on the procurement network, your report was one of 4 that surfaced as early documentation." Olivia looked at the table, then at him. "I was told that report was reviewed and closed. I was told there was nothing there. There was plenty there, Braun said. Someone made sure the right people didn't see it. She sat with that for a moment. She thought about the 4 months after she filed that report. The strange quiet, the reassignment, the feeling of being moved sideways without being told why. She had processed that time as the institution clearing its throat and then moving on. It had not occurred to her, in a specific and documentable way, that it had been something more intentional. Who knew? She asked. We're still working that out, but there are names in the documentation that connect to Riverside's procurement history. That's why we came here first when the explosion happened. And that's why... He stopped again. Say it, she said. Your record was part of what was buried, he said. When you were transferred out of Fort Delmore, 3 commendations from your deployment cycle were removed from your accessible file. They still exist. They're in the classified archive. But to anyone doing a routine background check, to anyone at a hospital running a standard credential review, they wouldn't show. Olivia was very quiet. That's not... She started and stopped, because she was thinking about the last 2 years, about the things she had not been able to explain when she interviewed at Riverside, about the gaps in her documented record that she had tried to account for and couldn't fully, about the clinical coordinator who had looked at her paperwork with a slight frown and said something about incomplete service documentation, and Olivia had said yes, the military records process is slow, and the coordinator had moved on, but with a particular kind of doubt left in the room that had never quite dispersed. Someone cleared a path to make you look like less than you were, Braun said, and we need to understand who and why, because the same people who buried your report are connected to the same network that falsified inspection results and contributed to this morning's explosion. The silence after that was different from the one before it. Outside the conference room door, someone's radio crackled. A voice. Surgical requesting bay 4 turnover. ETA, 3 minutes. Olivia sat very still for another second. Then she stood. I need to get back, she said. I know. Braun stood too. But Olivia, this isn't going away. The OIG is upstairs with Calvert right now, and what they're building is connected directly to what happened to your record. When the time comes, and it's coming soon, probably today, we're going to need your account of what happened at Fort Delmore. You'll have it, she said. She moved toward the door and then stopped with her hand on the frame. The commendations, she said, without turning. What were they for? A pause. 2 were for combat medical operations, Rashidabad Forward Base, 2019, 14 personnel extracted under active fire. The 3rd was for an incident 6 months later that's still partially restricted, but the classification summary describes it as, he looked at something on his phone, Extraordinary Medical Command under mass casualty conditions, Allied personnel, 0 fatalities attributable to medical failure. 14 people. She remembered all of their names. She pushed the door open and went back to the ER. The floor had changed while she was in the conference room. The immediate chaos had reorganized into the slower, more grinding work of sustained critical care, checking pressures, managing drips, rotating staff who had been on their feet for 2.5 hours and were starting to make the small, dangerous errors that fatigue produced. Olivia moved through it automatically, picking up where she'd left off with Jorge, checking in on Harriet Voss, whose pressure had stabilized and who was now being prepped for a chest imaging series. Harriet reached out and caught Olivia's wrist as she passed. You're the one who did it, Harriet said. Her voice was stronger now, rough-edged but functional. The chest thing. Yes. I couldn't breathe. She paused. And then I could. Olivia looked at her. You're going to be okay. Harriet's grip on her wrist didn't loosen right away. I worked at Halcott, she said. Administrative. 30 years. Olivia went still. I have a box, Harriet said. Her eyes moved to the doorway, then back. In my car. In the lot. I brought it in this morning because... She stopped, coughed once, winced. I was going to go to the city inspector's office today. I have been trying to go for 8 months. She looked at Olivia with the exhausted, complicated expression of someone who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time. The maintenance logs, the inspection records, the internal memos about the pressure systems, I have copies of everything. The monitor above her head beeped twice. "My car is the blue Corolla," Harriet said. "Space 44, East Lot. The box is in the trunk." She finally released Olivia's wrist. "I don't know who to trust here." Olivia looked at her for a long moment. "I know someone," she said. She found Braun in the corridor outside the ER within 90 seconds. She told him about the car, about the box, about Harriet Voss's 30 years at Halcott, and 8 months of trying to do the right thing and not being able to get anyone to listen. Braun listened without interrupting. Then he made one phone call, said 4 words, East Lot, Space 44, and put his phone away. "How did she know to trust you?" he asked. Olivia considered the question. "She didn't exactly," she said. "She just ran out of other options." She understood that feeling better than she would have liked to admit. She was turning back toward the ER when she heard it. Not the building's ambient noise, not the radio traffic, not the ventilation hum. Something else. A specific voice moving up the corridor from the direction of the main entrance, carrying the particular sharp register of a man who had decided that urgency was the same thing as authority. She turned. Richard Calvert was walking toward the ER with his attorney at his side. A compact man in a charcoal jacket who had clearly just arrived and was still orienting himself, and 2 hospital security personnel who looked like they were not entirely certain whose instructions they were currently following. Calvert's face had the color and tension of someone who had been in a difficult room for a long time and had emerged having made a decision. He saw Olivia. He stopped. "She is not authorized to be in this facility," he said, to no one specifically. "I want her removed, now." The 2 security guards looked at each other, then at Olivia, then past her, at the ER behind her, where the low sounds of a floor managing 37 patients filtered out into the corridor. Then at the 2 military personnel who had materialized at Braun's sides without anyone quite clocking when that had happened. Nobody moved toward Olivia. Calvert's attorney put a hand on his arm, a low voice. "Richard?" Calvert shook it off. "This is my hospital. She was terminated this morning, and her access was revoked. And I want—" "Mr. Calvert." Braun's voice was not loud. It was the kind of voice that didn't need to be. "I'd encourage you to consider your current situation carefully before you finish that sentence." The corridor was not empty. There were nurses at the station. There was an aide with a supply cart who had stopped pretending to work. There was Garrett Solis visible through the window of Bay 3, watching through the glass. Calvert looked at Braun, at the uniform, at the 2 other personnel flanking him. "Who are you?" he said. "Major Elliot Braun, United States Army, and the woman you're trying to remove is currently providing critical medical care to 37 patients, 2 of whom are in conditions that your own ER lacks the staff capacity to manage without her." A pause. "Additionally, I'd suggest you speak with your attorney before making any further personnel decisions today." Calvert's attorney said something very quietly into his ear. Calvert's face moved through several different arrangements. He did not order security to move. The corridor held its strange collective breath. And then, from the direction of the stairwell at the far end, Special Agent Reyes appeared. She had another agent with her, and between them, 2 people Olivia didn't recognize. A man and a woman in civilian clothes with the look of people whose identification carried significant weight. Reyes looked at Calvert. "Mr. Calvert," she said, "we asked you not to leave the administrative floor." "I have rights," he said. "I have not been charged with—" "We've completed the initial document review," Reyes said, "and I need you to return upstairs. Your attorney is welcome to accompany you." She looked at the 2 people behind her. "These are investigators from the State Medical Board. They're here regarding the compliance certifications." The man from the State Medical Board looked at Calvert with the specific neutrality of someone who had already formed an opinion and was not going to share it in a hallway. The attorney took Calvert's arm. "Come on," he said. Quiet, firm. Calvert went, not gracefully, not without the kind of look back that was supposed to communicate something, a warning, a promise, some residual assertion of authority. But he went. And as he did, as the hallway began to decompress back into the ordinary sounds of a hospital under strain, Olivia noticed something she hadn't registered until now. Harriet Voss's room was visible from where she stood, through the half-open curtain of Bay 4. And from the bed, Harriet was watching the corridor, watching Calvert leave, watching Reyes and the medical board investigators, watching all of it with the expression of someone who has been waiting for a very long time to see a particular door begin to close. Olivia didn't know yet what was in the box in the blue Corolla's trunk, but standing in that corridor, watching the specific gravity of the moment press down on everyone in it, she knew that whatever Harriet had spent 30 years learning and 8 months trying to release, it was already loose in the world. And Calvert, 2 floors above her now and rising, had not yet understood what that meant. But Calvert, 2 floors above and rising, had not yet understood what that meant, and the box in the blue Corolla's trunk was already being retrieved. Braun had sent one of his personnel, a staff sergeant named Wickies, to the east lot with Harriet Voss's key fob. Wickies was back in 11 minutes with a standard banker's box sealed with packing tape and a handwritten label that said HV, reference only, in the careful script of someone who had learned not to write anything that looked like what it actually was. He carried it through the ER corridor without explanation and set it on the table in the small conference room at the end of the hall, and then Special Agent Reyes appeared because Braun had called her, and then the state medical board investigator appeared because Reyes had called him, and the room that smelled like burned coffee became, in the space of about 20 minutes, the operational center of something significantly larger than a morning's administrative dispute. Olivia was not in that room. She was in the ER, where she still had work to do, and where the work was the only thing she could fully control. The afternoon had settled into its sustained, grinding rhythm, the kind that came after the acute phase and was in some ways harder, because the urgency that had been keeping people upright was metabolizing into something slower and heavier. She watched the floor staff moving with the particular fatigue of people who had already given everything once and were now being asked to give a little more. She redistributed tasks where she could. She covered 2 assessments that the charge nurse didn't have bandwidth for. She checked on Jorge, the 17-year-old with the concussion and the fractured fingers, whose parents had finally been allowed back to sit with him, and who looked at Olivia when she came in with an expression she had learned to recognize. The face of a parent who has just understood that the situation was worse than they knew and better than it could have been, simultaneously. "He's going to be okay," she told them, not elaborating, just saying it the way she meant it. Jorge's mother squeezed her son's hand and didn't say anything, and that was enough. Olivia was coming out of his room when Garrett Solis fell into step beside her. He had the look of someone who had been working up to something for the better part of 2 hours. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Probably." "When Calvert came down here earlier," he paused, "you weren't scared." She thought about that. It wasn't quite the right word for what she'd felt, but she didn't correct him. "What's your question?" "How do you do that? I don't mean the medical stuff, I mean the other part. The part where someone with that much power tells you to leave and you just don't." She stopped walking. She turned and looked at him, because he deserved an honest look, and not just a walking answer. He was young, and he had been in that hallway this morning, and he had not said anything, and she suspected he had been thinking about that all day. "You learn," she said. "Usually because at some point you're in a situation where the cost of leaving is higher than the cost of staying, and then the next time you know what that cost feels like." She held his gaze for a moment. "You were in the corridor this morning." He looked at the floor. "Yeah." "You didn't say anything." "No." He looked up. "I know." She nodded once. It wasn't absolution and it wasn't condemnation. It was just acknowledgement, which was sometimes the only honest currency available. "Keep moving," she said. "Basics needs a pressure check." He went. The box yielded what Harriet Voss had said it would, and more. Reyes worked through the contents methodically while one of her colleagues photographed each document before it was handled. There were maintenance logs, 12 months of them, showing that the pressure systems at Halcott's primary and secondary storage structures had been flagged internally for recalibration 7 times. There were internal memos written in the flat, evasive language of institutional self-protection that danced around the problem without naming it. There was an email chain. Harriet had printed the whole thing, 41 pages, between Halcott's operations director and a name that appeared on Riverside's compliance certification sign-offs. The email chain discussed the inspection timeline. It discussed what the inspection should and should not examine. It discussed, in language that was almost elegant in its indirectness, the mutual benefit of a favorable report. The state medical board investigator, whose name was Okafor and who had been doing this work for 19 years, read the email chain twice. Then he put it down and looked at Reyes. "That's conspiracy to falsify a federal compliance certification," he said. "Yes," said Reyes, "and the man whose name is on those emails is the same man who signed the inspection report." "Yes." Okafor sat back. "Who else knows about this box?" "Right now, the people in this room, the nurse who got us access to the patient, and the major outside the door." "We need a warrant expansion," Okafor said, "tonight." "Already in progress." Reyes was already on her phone. At 4:17 in the afternoon, 3 things happened within approximately 8 minutes of each other. The first, Dr. Patricia Morrow came to find Olivia at the nurse's station and told her, without preamble and without particular warmth, but with a directness that Olivia respected, that the ER had processed 41 of the 43 incoming patients, that 2 were in surgery, that no one had died under Riverside's care today, and that Morrow personally attributed the outcomes of at least 6 critical patients, she counted them, to interventions that had been made in Bay 4 during the first 90 minutes. "I don't know what your arrangement with the military is," Morrow said, "and I don't know what Calvert is going to do when he resurfaces. But for the record, what you did today was correct, clinically and otherwise." Olivia looked at her. "Thank you." Morrow made a small compressed gesture that suggested she found gratitude slightly uncomfortable and left. The second thing, Major Braun came out of the conference room and found Olivia and told her that the warrant expansion had been granted, that federal investigators were now authorized to access Riverside's Compliance Division records directly, and that Dr. Harlan Voss, no relation to Harriet, whose signature had appeared on the medication order that morning, and who had, it now emerged, co-signed 2 of the 4 problematic inspection certifications, had been located in his office, and was currently in a conversation he had not anticipated. "Voss signed the inspections?" Olivia said. "He wasn't the primary, but he was the institutional validator. His signature made the certifications official under the hospital's compliance authority." Braun paused. "He's also the one who called Calvert this morning, after you flagged the medication order." Olivia processed that. The medication order. The dosage irregularity she had caught in the 40 minutes before any of this began. In the operational cascade of the day, that small clinical flag had receded so far into the background that she had almost forgotten it was the thing that started all of it. "He called Calvert," she said, "because he was scared I'd found something." "Not the medication order specifically," Braun said, "but yes, you were flagging documentation. On a floor where Voss had been cutting corners on patient management to redirect clinical hours toward the compliance work. He panicked. Calvert moved fast. She stood with that for a moment. "They fired me," she said, "to stop me from finding out about an inspection fraud that killed 2 people." "They fired you," Braun said, "because you were the kind of person who noticed things, and they couldn't afford that." It landed differently than she expected, not with anger. She had moved past the first sharp heat of that hours ago, but with something heavier and more precise, the specific weight of understanding how completely and how deliberately she had been made invisible. The third thing that happened at 4:17 was that Richard Calvert attempted to leave the building. He had been, for the previous 2 hours, in his office with his attorney, cooperating selectively with Reyes's initial document requests while Donahue worked to establish what exactly the investigative scope covered and what it didn't. The attorney was good at his job. He had managed to slow the information exchange to a pace that bought time, and Calvert had used that time to do something he should not have done, which was access his administrative email on his phone and attempt to forward a specific document chain to an external address. The attempt was flagged automatically by the federal monitoring order that Reyes had placed on the hospital's digital infrastructure at 11 that morning, before she had even come upstairs. She had been expecting exactly this. Calvert was at the elevator bank on the 8th floor with his coat on and his briefcase in his hand when 2 agents intercepted him. There was no drama. There was no confrontation. There was a quiet, extremely firm conversation in which Calvert was told that the digital action he had taken 7 minutes ago constituted attempted destruction of evidence under an active federal investigation, and that he was being detained. The attorney, to his credit, had the presence of mind to say nothing. They brought Calvert back to his office. The door closed. From the hallway, nothing was visible except the shapes of people through the frosted glass panel beside the door. Word moved through the building the way it always did in institutions, not through formal announcement, but through the specific osmosis of people who were paying attention. By 5 o'clock, the nurses on the third floor knew that federal agents were in the building and that Calvert was not leaving. By 5:15, the attending physicians had heard a version of the story that was partly accurate. By 5:30, the news van that had been parked outside since morning was joined by 2 more, and the cameras were pointed at the building's main entrance with the steady patience of people who knew they were waiting for something worth filming. Olivia knew none of this in real time. She was in the ER, finishing documentation she had been working on in fragments all afternoon. Patient notes, assessment records. The clinical paper trail that needed to exist for the work of the day to be legible to whoever came after. She was thorough. She had always been thorough. It was the kind of habit that people either had or didn't, and she'd had it long before medical school, long before nursing, back in a time when the quality of your documentation could determine whether someone got the right care in the right window or didn't. She was on the last section of her notes when Braun appeared in the doorway of the small office behind the nurses' station where she'd been working. "There's a media situation developing outside," he said. "I heard. There's also something else." He came in and closed the door. His posture had changed slightly from what it had been all day. Something less contained, less managerially neutral. "Reyes has enough for an arrest warrant. The formal charge package is being finalized now. Calvert, Voss, and 2 members of the compliance team." Olivia looked at him. "Tonight?" "Within the hour, probably. The U.S. Attorney's Office has been on a call with Reyes for the last 40 minutes. He paused. "I also need to tell you something else. Before this becomes public." She put her pen down. "The commendations we talked about this morning," he said. "The ones that were removed from your accessible record. My command has been in contact with the records office at Fort Delmore. The process for restoring classified commendations to an individual's service record is not fast, normally. There's a board review, a JAG sign-off, a multi-step verification." "I know," she said. "Normally, yes. But my commander contacted the oversight board directly this afternoon, and given the direct connection between the suppression of your record and the federal investigation currently in progress, they've authorized an expedited reinstatement." He stopped. "Your full service record, with all 3 commendations, will be officially restored and accessible, probably by tomorrow morning." Olivia looked at him for a long moment. She tried to locate inside herself what she expected to feel in a moment like this, some version of relief, or vindication, or the satisfaction of something corrected. What she found instead was something more complicated and less clean. Something that felt less like an ending and more like the exhumation of a fact that had always been true and had simply been made inaccessible. "It was always there," she said. "Yes." "They couldn't actually take it away." "No, they could only hide it." She nodded slowly. That distinction mattered. She wasn't entirely sure why it mattered so much in this moment, but it did. "Okay," she said. "There's one more thing." He reached into his jacket and produced a document, folded once. He set it on the desk in front of her. "This came from my CO about 20 minutes ago. I was asked to deliver it personally." She picked it up, unfolded it. It was a single page, official letterhead, 2 paragraphs. She read it once, and then she read it again, and something happened in her face that she was not entirely able to control. Not tears, not the dramatic undoing that the moment might have seemed to call for, but a brief, involuntary stillness, a suspension of the ordinary forward motion. The document was a formal commendation from the Department of the Army, addressed to Staff Sergeant Olivia D. Hart, detailing the action at Rashidabad Forward Base and its outcome. At the bottom, a line she had not expected. "The individuals named in this commendation demonstrated leadership under conditions that exceeded the parameters of their assigned role and produced outcomes that preserved life where the probability of loss was high. The Army recognizes this record with gratitude. She set it down. My CO will want to speak with you directly when this is done, Braun said. She nodded. She couldn't quite locate her voice. It took her a moment. The people I pulled out of Rashidabad, she said. Do you know where they are? Braun looked at her steadily. Some of them. 3 are still active duty, 2 are medically discharged. The others, I'd have to check. He paused. Why? She looked at the document. I just want to know they're okay, Anjit. At 6:11 in the evening, Richard Calvert walked out of Riverside Medical Center in handcuffs. He did not walk quickly. He was escorted by 2 federal agents, one on each side, and his attorney was beside him with the closed expression of a man who had stopped trying to manage the optics and was now focused entirely on the longer game. The walk from the main entrance to the waiting federal vehicle was approximately 40 feet. It took longer than 40 feet should take, because the cameras were there, because the reporters had been positioned, because the light was falling at exactly the angle that made the scene maximally legible to anyone watching. Olivia was not outside. She was still inside, at the nurse's station, where she was finishing the last of her documentation. But Dennis Falk was by the window, and he saw it, and he said, without turning, "They got him." Nobody in the station said anything for a moment. Then Garrett Solis said quietly, "Good." It was Harriet Voss who changed the final shape of the evening. She had been moved to a semi-private room on the 4th floor after her chest imaging came back showing no additional complications. She was on supplemental oxygen, a nasal cannula, and she looked her age in the way that people look their age when they have just been through something real and the performance of being fine has temporarily dropped away. When Olivia came to check on her at 6:45, she found Harriet sitting up with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes clear. "I heard they arrested him," Harriet said. "Yes, Calvert." She said the name like it had a specific weight. "I watched him sign off on the inspection report. Not literally, but I saw the signed version come through our administrative system. I knew what it was, I knew what it wasn't." She looked at her hands. "I told my supervisor. She told me I was misreading the document. 2 weeks later, I was moved to a different department." Olivia sat down in the chair beside her bed. She didn't hurry it. "I kept copies anyway," Harriet said. "I don't know why exactly. Habit, maybe? Or just, I couldn't let it be like it didn't exist." She looked at Olivia. "Does that make sense?" "Yes," Olivia said. "It makes complete sense." Harriet studied her. "You kept copies too," she said. Not a question. "Of something, I can tell." Olivia thought about the report she had filed at Fort Delmore. The incident documentation she had written and submitted and been told meant nothing. She had not kept a copy. She had trusted the institution to hold it, and the institution had buried it instead. "I should have," she said. Harriet was quiet for a moment. Then, "The 2 people who died today, in the explosion." "Yes." "One of them was a man named Curtis Barr. He was a floor supervisor. He'd been at Halcott for 22 years. She looked at the window. "He knew about the pressure system too. He wrote a formal maintenance request 14 months ago. It was denied." She paused. "I have that denial letter. It's in the box." Olivia looked at her. "Reyes needs to know that specifically." "I know." Harriet turned back to her. "But I wanted to tell you first, because you're the one who heard me." The room was quiet. Down the corridor, the normal sounds of a hospital floor in the early evening, monitors, voices, the distant roll of a supply cart, filtered in and then receded. Olivia was sitting in the chair and thinking, in the specific slightly sideways way she thought, when something was still assembling itself, about what Harriet had just said. "You're the one who heard me." She had not done anything extraordinary with Harriet. She had done a procedure and then she had listened. She had stood at the bed and received the information being offered and had taken it seriously instead of routing it through the filter of what was convenient. That was supposed to be the baseline. That was supposed to be the ordinary standard. She thought about the medication order that morning, about flagging a dosage concern because it was wrong, which was the only reason that existed for flagging a dosage concern. She thought about the report at Fort Delmore, about seeing a discrepancy in the transfer logs and writing it down because discrepancies in supply chains in a combat theater had life or death downstream consequences, and the correct response to that observation was to document it. She had not been doing anything remarkable. She had just been doing her job. And the system had mobilized against her, twice, because doing her job accurately had been inconvenient to people with more leverage. She was still sitting with that when her phone rang. It was a number she didn't recognize. She almost let it go. Then something made her answer. "Heart," she said. A pause. A slight ambient noise, wind or a ventilation system, or the background hum of a different kind of building. Then a voice she had not heard in 4 years. Olivia. Male. Older. The kind of voice that belonged to someone who had spent decades giving instructions in environments where being misunderstood carried consequences. "This is Colonel Harwick. I imagine you've had a long day." She sat very still. Colonel Raymond Harwick had commanded the Forward Medical Support Unit at Fort Delmore. He had signed the paperwork that reassigned her out of the theater. He had been the one to tell her, in person, in his office, with the window behind him and the desert light coming in flat and white, that her incident report had been reviewed and that there was nothing actionable in it. "Colonel," she said. "I owe you an explanation," he said. "And I think, given what's happened today, tonight is probably the last window I'm going to have to give it to you before other people start asking questions. I'd rather you heard from me first." The room seemed to shrink slightly around her. "I'm listening," she said. "I'm listening," she said, and she meant it in the specific way she had learned to mean things. Not as a social pleasantry, but as a statement of readiness, of attention directed fully forward. Harwick took a breath that was audible over the phone. Not dramatic. Just the sound of a man who was 63 years old and had been carrying a particular weight for long enough that setting it down required some physical effort. "The incident report you filed in March of 2021, he said. "The supply chain discrepancy at the Forward Logistics Base. You documented an irregularity in material transfer logs, specifically a divergence between incoming manifest records and physical inventory counts for a class of components that were listed under a DoD logistics contract." "I know what I filed," she said. "Yes, I know you do." A pause. "What I told you at the time was that the report had been reviewed and found to contain insufficient basis for further investigation. That was not accurate." The hospital room was very still. Harriet Voss, on the bed, had gone quiet in the specific way of someone who understood they were adjacent to a private conversation and was making themselves as absent as possible without moving. "What was accurate," Harwick continued, "was that the report was reviewed, by me initially, and then by 2 other people whose names I'm going to give you tonight, because I've already given them to the OIG, and I don't want you hearing them from a federal agent before you hear them from me." Olivia said nothing. She was listening. "The logistics contract that your discrepancy connected to had a secondary authorization layer that went above my command level. When I brought the report up through proper channels, I was instructed, directly, in writing, which I kept, to classify it and close the inquiry. I was told the discrepancy was a clerical error that had already been corrected. I was told that further examination would interfere with an ongoing procurement audit at a higher classification level." He stopped. "I believed the first part. I was less certain about the second, but I complied." Olivia thought about what that meant. She thought about March of 2021, about the weeks after she filed the report, about the specific quality of the silence that had descended. Not hostile, not punitive in any visible way, just quiet in the way of something sealed. She had read it as bureaucratic inertia. She had moved on, the way you moved on from things you couldn't change. "You reassigned me," she said. "Yes, because the people above you wanted me away from the forward base and the logistics chain. That was my assessment at the time, yes." His voice was flat with the specific flatness of self-awareness. "I told myself I was protecting you, moving you out of the line of whatever was coming. That was partly true, and partly—" He stopped. "Partly, I was protecting myself from the complication of having you there." She appreciated that he said it. She didn't appreciate it warmly, but she recognized the quality of honesty in it. "The names," she said. He gave her 2. The first was a procurement official in a DoD contracting division whose name she didn't recognize. The second was a name she did recognize because it appeared in the email chain Harriet Voss had spent 30 years assembling, the same name that connected Riverside's compliance division to Halcott Distribution's inspection sign-offs. The thread that Reyes was pulling from the box of documents ran all the way back to a forward logistics base in the 3rd Theater, and it passed directly through the 4 years that had turned Olivia Hart from a decorated combat medic into a nurse with an incomplete service record at a regional hospital in Port Sterling. The commendations, she said, were removed on the instruction of the procurement official, Harwick said. I did not authorize that. I want to be clear. When I found out, it was already done, and the access pathway that would have allowed me to reverse it had been closed. A pause. That is not an excuse. I should have pushed harder. I didn't. Olivia looked at the window across the room. Outside, it was full dark now, the city doing whatever the city did after a day like this one. Somewhere out there, families were getting news, press briefings were being drafted. The legal machinery was beginning its slow, deliberate grinding. In here, a room smelled like antiseptic and recycled air and the specific human smell of someone who had been frightened and hurt and was beginning to be less frightened. "What do you want from me, Colonel?" she asked. "Nothing," he said. "That's not why I'm calling." Another pause, longer. "I'm calling because you're going to be in rooms over the next several days where people are going to tell you a version of what happened to your record. I wanted you to have the version that's actually true before that happens. And I'm calling because—" He stopped for the 3rd time, which was more times than she had ever heard Harwick stop in a sentence. He was a man who chose his words and deployed them efficiently and did not typically falter. "Because I owe you that, at minimum. And I'm aware that minimum is not very much." She sat with that. "Is this call being recorded?" she asked. "Yes. I'm making this call from OIG Field Office in Branton. I came in voluntarily this afternoon. Everything I've told you tonight is going into the official record." She hadn't expected that. It shifted something in the calculation. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he repeated. Quieter. She ended the call and sat in the chair beside Harriet Voss's bed and did not move for approximately 90 seconds. Harriet said, carefully, "Do you need anything?" Olivia looked at her. "No," she said. "Thank you." She stood. "Try to sleep. Someone from the investigative team will want to talk to you tomorrow, and you'll need to be rested for it." Harriet nodded. "Olivia." She stopped. "Curtis Barr had a daughter," Harriet said. 19 years old. He was the one who drove her to college in August. He told me about it. He was so proud of her." She looked at her hands. "She's going to find out tonight, if she hasn't already." Olivia looked at her for a long moment. "I know," she said. She didn't say anything else. There wasn't anything else to say that would have been honest. Fun. She found Braun in the corridor outside the ER at 7:40, which was the first time all day she had been in that corridor without having somewhere specific to be. The ER was quiet now, in the way that followed sustained crisis. Not peace, exactly, but the particular exhaustion of a space that had processed more than it was built for, and was now attempting to recalibrate. The overnight team had taken over an hour ago. The day staff was trickling out. She told Braun about the call from Harwick. He listened without interrupting, which she had come to understand was his default mode. Not passive, just precise about when speaking added something and when it didn't. "He went in voluntarily," Braun said when she finished. "That's what he said." Then Reyes already has his statement. He thought for a moment. The procurement official he named, that's going to extend the investigation significantly beyond Riverside and Halcott. That's a federal contracting case. Different jurisdiction, different timeline. "I know," she said. "That's not my immediate concern." "What is?" She looked at him. Harwick said someone above his command level instructed him to bury the report. Someone authorized the removal of my commendations. Those are not small decisions. Those don't get made by a mid-level procurement official on his own. Braun was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "They don't." "So there's someone else?" "Yes," he said. "Probably." And that person is not currently in federal custody. Not as of the last update I received. He paused. Reyes knows. This is not a thread she's going to drop. Olivia nodded. She had understood for most of the day that the situation was larger than Calvert and Voss and the compliance fraud at Riverside. The shape of it had been assembling itself steadily from the first moment Braun walked into Bay 4 and called her by her old rank. And what the shape resolved into was not the neat, containable thing she might have wished for. A bad administrator, a negligent physician, a falsified inspection report. What it was instead was something that had been running for years, quietly, in the spaces between legitimate operations, and that had clipped her without her even fully understanding she had been clipped, and had cost 2 people their lives this morning, and had very nearly cost 6 more. She was tired. She was tired in a way that ran deeper than the day's physical demands, a tiredness that she recognized as the specific cost of having spent 10 hours navigating a situation that kept expanding its own perimeter. "I need to go home," she said. "I know," Braun said. "We'll need you for a formal statement tomorrow. OIG, probably 9 or 10 in the morning. I'll confirm the location." She nodded. She picked up her canvas bag from behind the nurse's station where it had been sitting since 7 in the morning, still packed, still containing the photograph she had looked at in the locker room before any of this began. She was halfway to the exit when Dennis Falk appeared. Hart. He had his jacket on, end of shift. His face had the look of a man who was choosing his words with some care. "I've been at Riverside for 11 years, he said. "I've seen a lot of people come and go, and I've seen the administration do things that—" He stopped. "What happened to you this morning was wrong. I should have said something." She looked at him. He was not a man who said things he didn't mean. She had figured that out within the first month of working with him. 11 years is a long time to have something to lose, she said. "It is," he said. "That's not an excuse." "I know it's not." She paused. "Thank you, Dennis." He nodded. She went out. The morning after was a Tuesday. Olivia had slept 4 hours in the specific, compressed way of someone whose system had finally forced the issue, and she woke at 5:15 to 4 missed calls and 11 text messages and an email from the OIG field office in Branton, confirming her statement appointment for 9:30. She read all of it in the order it had arrived, showered, made coffee that was too strong, and sat at her kitchen table with the photograph she had taken out of her bag the previous night and set face up on the counter. 3 figures. Desert Light. She was the one on the left. The other 2 were Corporal Destin Gozi and Sergeant Marcus Pallone, both of whom she had served with at Rashidabad, and both of whom, she had verified at some point during the previous night's 4 hours of fractured sleep, were alive. Gozi had been discharged in 2022, medical. Pallone was still active, somewhere in the Pacific Theater. She looked at the photograph for a moment. Then she put it back in her bag and went to the OIG field office. The statement took 2.5 hours. Reyes ran it with a colleague, and there was a federal attorney present, and Olivia went through the Rashidabad logistics discrepancy from the beginning. The specific numbers, the specific dates, the specific nature of the irregularity she had observed and documented. She went through the conversation with Harwick when she was told the report was closed. She described the reassignment, the transfer, the gaps in her service record that she had spent 2 years trying to account for and couldn't. She described the first 2 years at Riverside. She described the medication order. She described the morning. She was precise. She did not embellish and she did not minimize. She said when she was certain and she said when she was estimating. The federal attorney made notes and occasionally asked clarifying questions. And Reyes listened in the focused, evaluative way she had that made it clear she was not just collecting information, but building something with it. At 11:15, the attorney set down his pen and looked at Reyes. "That connects," he said. "Yes," Reyes said. Olivia looked between them. "Connects to what specifically?" Reyes opened a folder. "Over the past 16 months, the procurement network your 2021 report touched has been traced through 4 different contracting entities. Halcott was one of 3 civilian facilities that held secondary contracts under the DoD logistics chain. The falsified inspection reports allowed all 3 facilities to continue operating with known safety deficiencies while maintaining their contract status. The financial benefit from that arrangement flowed through a layered billing structure that," She stopped. This is going to be public within 48 hours, so I'll tell you. The billing structure connects to a holding company that is partially owned by a former senior defense contracting official named Walter Prine. Olivia didn't recognize the name. Prine retired from federal service in 2020, Reyes said. He held a senior position in the contracting division that oversaw the logistics chain your report flagged. He left 6 months before you filed your report. The private company he moved into after retirement maintained contracts with the same DoD logistics network through civilian intermediaries. She paused. Harwick's statement names Prine as the person who instructed him to classify your report. There it was. The person who was not currently in federal custody. Where is he? Olivia asked. As of this morning, Reyes said, he's in a meeting with his attorney. She closed the folder. We expect to move on him today. Item. She was outside the OIG field office at noon, standing in the kind of flat gray daylight that Port Sterling produced in the fall, when Braun called. The board chair wants to meet with you, he said. Sylvia Hartwell. She's been trying to reach you since last night. I know, Olivia said. I haven't called her back. She's asking for this afternoon. She has the full board available. Olivia looked at the street. A delivery truck went past. 2 people were eating lunch on a bench outside the building across the road, apparently unconcerned with anything. The ordinary texture of a city that had absorbed a crisis and was already returning to its general momentum. What does she want? Olivia asked. Based on what she told my liaison, she wants to apologize. On behalf of the board. On behalf of the board. Olivia thought about that, about the formal quality of an institutional apology, the way it was structured to be meaningful and to provide liability protection simultaneously, the way it was always both. Fine, she said. This afternoon. The board met in the same conference room on the 7th floor where, under different circumstances, the kind of decisions that had led to this morning were made. Hartwell was already there when Olivia arrived, with 4 other board members and the hospital's legal counsel, and the quality of the room was different from any room Olivia had sat in at Riverside before, quieter, more careful, carrying the specific weight of people who had spent the past 20 hours understanding the full scope of what had been done under their institutional umbrella. Hartwell was a woman in her early 60s with the composed bearing of someone who had been managing difficult situations for a long time, and she looked at Olivia with an expression that was neither warm nor cold, but genuinely reckoning. Miss Hart, she said, please sit down. Olivia sat. I'll be direct, Hartwell said. The board has been briefed fully on the events of yesterday and on the federal investigation that is now underway. We have also been briefed on the circumstances of your suspension. She paused. What was done to you yesterday morning was incorrect, and it was done using processes that are supposed to protect staff, not be weaponized against them. On behalf of this board, I am apologizing to you without qualification. Olivia looked at her. Thank you, she said. Your suspension is rescinded, effective immediately. Your back pay for the day will be processed by Friday. Hartwell looked at the legal counsel briefly, then back. We are also initiating an independent review of every personnel action taken under Calvert's authority, going back to his arrival at Riverside, to determine whether other staff members were treated similarly. That was more than Olivia had expected. She didn't show it. The clinical work you performed yesterday, Hartwell continued, has been reviewed by Dr. Morrow and by an independent physician consultant. Their assessment is that your interventions were not only appropriate, but were, in several cases, responsible for outcomes that would have been significantly worse without you. She folded her hands. We have a vacancy in clinical leadership, Director of Emergency Services. The position has been open since March. We'd like to offer it to you. The room was quiet. Olivia looked at the table for a moment. Then she looked at Hartwell. I appreciate that, she said. I'll consider it seriously, but I need to understand what structural changes are being made before I'd be willing to commit. Because the problems yesterday weren't just Calvert, they were systemic, and a title change doesn't fix a system. Hartwell looked at her for a moment. Then she said, That's a fair answer. It's the only one I have right now? Then we'll have that conversation when you're ready. Hartwell pushed a document folder across the table. Your formal reinstatement paperwork. The apology is also in writing, which was not legally required, but which we felt was right. Olivia took the folder. She looked at it. The Riverside letterhead, her name in the header, the board signatures at the bottom. 2 years and 4 months of work, a morning's worth of destruction, a folder's worth of repair. None of it was sufficient. She knew that and suspected Hartwell knew it too. But it was there, in her hands. And it was real. The arrest of Walter Prine was not covered live because it happened at 2:40 in the afternoon, in the parking garage of a building in Branton, where Prine's attorney had offices, and it was not the kind of arrest that looked like anything from the outside. 2 vehicles, 4 agents, a brief exchange, and then Prine in the back seat of a federal vehicle heading toward a processing center. No cameras, no reporters. The press release came out at 4 o'clock, and by 4:30 the news vans that had been staked outside Riverside Medical Center were on the highway to Branton, and the story that had spent the morning being about a hospital explosion and the afternoon being about a corrupt administrator and a fraudulent inspection scheme was now being something else, something that had a longer timeline and a higher reach than anyone watching the morning's events could have initially understood. Olivia found out about Prine's arrest from Braun, who texted her a single line. Prine in custody. Reyes says the chain is complete. She was in her apartment when she read it. She had gone home after the board meeting, still carrying the folder, still in the same clothes she had put on 24 hours earlier, and she had sat down on her couch for what she intended to be 5 minutes and had not moved for 40. She read the text. She set the phone down. She looked at the ceiling. The chain is complete. She understood what that meant operationally. The investigative line from the 2021 logistics discrepancy to the compliance fraud to Halcott's exploding pressure systems to Curtis Barr and the unnamed maintenance worker who had also died in the blast. The chain that had passed through her life and left marks she had not fully understood were there. It was complete in the sense that all the links were now visible and documented. That was not the same as finished. Finished was a long time away. Through depositions and grand jury proceedings and trials that would each take months and would surface new information and new complications, and the complete picture of what the network had done and who had known and who had looked away would emerge slowly and imperfectly over the next several years. She knew all of that. She had seen enough institutional processes to understand their pace and their imprecision, but the chain was complete, and she was in it, and she was not buried in it. And her name was in the documentation as the person who had seen the first irregularity in 2021 and had written it down correctly. And that report, suppressed, classified, dismissed, and then finally recovered, was now the foundational document in a federal case. She had been right. She had always been right. It had just taken 4 years and a catastrophic morning for that fact to become accessible. She was still looking at the ceiling when her phone rang again. Unknown number, different from Harwick's the previous night. She answered. "Is this Olivia Hart?" A young woman's voice, hesitant. "Yes. My name is Sasha Barr." A pause. "My dad was Curtis Barr. He worked at Halcott." Olivia closed her eyes briefly, then she opened them. "Sasha," she said. "Yes, I'm here. I got your name from... There was a woman, a patient, named Harriet. She's the one who gave me this number." The voice was controlled in the specific way of someone who has been crying recently and has temporarily stopped. "She said you were the person I should talk to. She said you were trying to..." Another pause. "I don't really know what she meant, but she said to call." "She was right to say that," Olivia said. I don't know what happened yet, not the whole thing. Nobody will tell me the whole thing." A crack in the controlled voice, quickly covered. "He called me Sunday night. We talked for 20 minutes. He was telling me about the basketball team. I play basketball. And he said he'd come see me play in November." A stop. "He's not going to come." Olivia sat on the couch. She did not try to fill the space quickly. She had learned that too. That the impulse to fill a space like this one was about managing your own discomfort, not about the person on the other end. "No," she said. "He's not." Sasha Barr was quiet for a moment. "The thing that happened to the building," she said, did someone make it happen? Like, could someone have stopped it? Olivia thought about how to answer that. She thought about the maintenance request that Curtis Barr had filed 14 months ago. She thought about the denial letter that was now in a federal evidence file. She thought about what it meant to answer this question honestly to a 19-year-old whose father had driven her to college in August. Yes, she said, someone could have stopped it. Another silence. Longer. Then who's going to answer for that? Sasha asked. Olivia looked at the folder on her coffee table, at the Riverside letterhead, at the federal case number that Reyes had given her in the field office at noon, at the name Walter Prine and the name Richard Calvert and the name Harlan Voss, each of them now documented and accounted for and moving through a process that would, imperfectly and slowly and incompletely, arrive at some version of consequence. People are answering for it right now, she said, and more will. I can tell you what I know, and I can help you find the people who know the rest of it, if you want that. I want that, Sasha said. Okay, Olivia said. Then let's start. She reached for a pen, and it was exactly as she was turning over the folder to write on the back of it. Sasha's number, Sasha's name, the beginning of a list of things that needed doing in the days ahead, that she noticed something on the front page of the reinstatement paperwork she hadn't looked at closely in the board meeting. A second document underneath the formal reinstatement letter with a different letterhead, not Riverside, not the Army. A letterhead she had to look at twice before she recognized it. Office of the Inspector General, Department of Defense, dated today. She set down the pen and read it. It was addressed to her. It referenced the 2021 incident report, the suppression, the commendation reinstatement, and then it described, in the measured official language of a federal document, something she had not been told about in the OIG field office that morning. The third commendation, the one Braun had described as partially restricted, whose classification summary referenced extraordinary medical command under mass casualty conditions and 0 fatalities attributable to medical failure. It had been declassified. That was not the part that stopped her. The part that stopped her was the operational detail that had previously been restricted. A single paragraph, now visible for the first time. The mass casualty event in question had not been a combat engagement. It had been an explosion, a structural failure at a forward logistics facility outside Rashidabad. 17 personnel, 14 extracted. The cause, per the newly declassified after-action report, a pressure system failure at a storage structure that had failed a prior safety inspection, an inspection whose results had been falsified before submission. In 2019, 2 years before she filed her report about the supply chain discrepancy, the pressure system failure, the falsified inspection, the same network, the same mechanism, a different facility, a different continent, 7 years earlier. And she had been there. She had pulled 14 people out of the wreckage and had never known what caused it, because the cause had been buried in the same place everything else got buried. She was sitting very still on her couch. On the phone, Sasha Barr's voice came back. Hello? Are you still there? Yes, Olivia said. Her voice was steady. She had made it steady. I'm still here. She looked at the document in her hand. Curtis Barr's maintenance request had been denied 14 months ago. The pressure system failure in Rashidabad had been buried in 2019. The same network, the same method, the same outcome. And somewhere in the chain of documentation that Reyes was building, somewhere in the files that connected Walter Prine to Halcott, to Riverside to Fort Delmore, there was a question that nobody had asked her yet. Not Reyes, not Braun, not Harwick in his voluntary statement, that was going to have to be asked. How many others? How many others? She wrote it on the back of the folder below Sasha's name and number, not as a question, as a task. Then she told Sasha she would call her tomorrow with more information, and that she wanted to connect her with Special Agent Reyes, who was the right person to walk her through the full case as it developed. Sasha said, okay, in the voice of someone who was holding herself together with both hands and knew it. Olivia stayed on the line an extra 30 seconds just to make sure there was something solid at the end of it before she hung up. Then she sat in her apartment in the dark. She hadn't turned a light on, and the window was giving her the city's ambient orange glow, which was enough. And she thought about how to carry the thing she had just read without letting its weight bend her in a direction that wasn't useful. 17 personnel, 14 extracted. Rashidabad, 2019. She had known those people by name, by face, by the specific sound of their voices in different conditions. She had not known, until 40 minutes ago, that the structure that came down around them had been condemned by its own internal safety review and cleared anyway because someone had needed it cleared. She had pulled people out of wreckage that should not have existed. She had done it well. She had done it without knowing she was also cleaning up the physical evidence of a decision made in an office somewhere by someone who had run the numbers and decided the risk was acceptable. That was the thing she had to sit with, not the anger. The anger was there, had been there, would probably always be there at some specific temperature in some specific part of her chest, but underneath it, a kind of grief that was older and harder to categorize. She had thought she understood what had happened at Rashidabad. She had thought it was a structural accident, the kind of thing that happened in forward operating environments under pressure and supply constraints. She had processed it that way. She had filed it under the experiences that were terrible and real and survivable, and she had moved forward. The file had been wrong. The processing had been based on false information. She didn't know yet what to do with that. So she wrote it down, how many others, and she put the pen on the table and she let herself be in the dark apartment for another hour, which was not nothing. It was the kind of thing you had to actually do and not skip. The next 3 weeks were not a single clean arc. That was the part that nobody who covered the story from the outside fully captured, the way the days moved between the dramatic and the bureaucratic with no predictable rhythm, the way a morning could contain a federal grand jury subpoena and an afternoon could contain 3 hours of documentation review, and the evening could contain a phone call from someone who had seen the coverage and wanted to tell her something she hadn't known. There were a lot of those calls. Reyes had given Olivia's contact information, with permission, to 4 other witnesses in the federal case, and each of them had eventually called. A former Halcott maintenance supervisor who had filed his own safety complaint in 2020 and been told it was unsubstantiated. A DoD procurement analyst who had raised concerns about the logistics contract in a 2018 internal review and found herself transferred within the month. A records clerk at a contracting firm who had noticed a pattern in the invoice documentation and had mentioned it to her supervisor and then stopped mentioning it because of what happened to her supervisor. None of them had known about the others. That was the specific loneliness of the thing, each person carrying their piece of it in isolation, each having concluded at some point that they were alone in what they'd seen, that the institution's silence was a verdict on the validity of their observation rather than a strategy deployed against it. She talked to all of them. She was not a therapist, and she didn't pretend to be. But she was someone who had been through the specific experience of seeing a thing clearly and being told the thing wasn't there, and she understood what it cost and what it took to hold on to your own version of reality when the institution pushed back with its full weight. That understanding was something she could offer, and she did. Richard Calvert was formally charged on a Wednesday, 3 weeks after the explosion, with conspiracy to falsify federal compliance certifications, obstruction of a federal investigation, and witness tampering, the last charge arising from the email he had attempted to send from his phone while federal monitoring was active on the hospital's systems. His attorney entered a not guilty plea. The arraignment was covered by 2 local stations and picked up by a national wire service. Dr. Harlan Voss was charged the same day on 2 counts of filing false certifications under a federal compliance program. He did not enter a not guilty plea. His attorney had spent the previous 2 weeks negotiating, and by the time the charges were filed, there was already a cooperation agreement in place that would, in exchange for Voss's testimony, reduce his exposure significantly. Olivia heard about the agreement from Reyes and felt the specific, impure emotion that cooperation deals always produced. The sense that justice and strategy were not the same thing and rarely ran in exactly the same direction, and that you had to make your peace with that or it would consume your energy that was needed elsewhere. Walter Prine's case was different in scale and therefore different in pace. He had resources, and he had attorneys who were experienced at the specific work of making federal prosecutions complicated, and the case against him was going to take longer and be harder and would probably not resolve for 18 months at minimum. Reyes was clear about that, and Olivia appreciated the clarity, even when the clarity was uncomfortable. There was no version of this where everything moved at the speed that the harm had accumulated, but the criminal referral for Prine included the Rashidabad connection, which meant the classified after-action report from 2019 was now part of an active federal case file. The people who had died or been injured in that collapse, the 3 who hadn't made it out, their families were now being located and notified by military liaisons. It was not justice. It was the beginning of a process that might eventually arrive somewhere in the vicinity of justice, which was not the same thing but was better than nothing, and better than the continued silence. The public hearing was Reyes's idea, or more precisely, it was the U.S. Attorney's idea executed through Reyes, and it happened on a gray Thursday morning in the Port Sterling City Council chamber, which had been repurposed for the occasion because the federal building didn't have a room large enough for the number of people who needed to be present. Olivia had not wanted to go. That was the honest version. She had wanted the outcome without the performance of the outcome, which was not how institutional accountability worked, and she knew it, but the wanting was real anyway. Braun had told her, straightforwardly and without pressure, that her presence would matter, not for the legal record, which was complete, but for the people in that room who needed to see a specific kind of thing. She had thought about it for a day, and then she had said yes. The chamber held about 200 people. It was full. There were survivors from the Halcott explosion, some of them still visibly recovering. There were families of the 2 people who had died. Curtis Barr's family, in the second row, Sasha in the aisle seat, 19 years old with her hands folded and her jaw set. There were former Halcott employees. There were Riverside staff, including Dennis Falk and Garrett Solis, and near the back, Dr. Patricia Morrow, who had come without announcement and sat with the contained observational stillness of someone fulfilling an obligation she had assigned herself. Sylvia Hartwell was there, with 2 other board members on the opposite side of the room from where Olivia sat. The U.S. Attorney, a woman named Castellano, who was precise and untheatrical in her delivery, read a summary of the charges and the evidence. She read the timeline. She read the names. She described, in the flat language of legal documentation, what the network had done and how long it had been doing it and what it had cost. It took 22 minutes. The room was completely silent for all of it. Then Major Braun spoke. He was in uniform, which was not a decision made casually, and he spoke about Olivia's service record in the specific factual way of a military commendation: dates, locations, outcomes, the classified after-action report from Rashidabad, now fully declassified and entered into the public record for the first time. He read the number 14. He said her name. He said the word extraordinary, which was a word the Army used rarely and with precision, and which landed in the chamber in a way that ordinary words did not. Olivia was sitting with her hands in her lap, and she was not looking at the room. She was looking at the middle distance somewhere above the chamber floor, the specific focus of someone who is receiving something they are not entirely sure they know how to hold. After Braun finished, Castellano opened the floor for brief statements from 3 of the survivor witnesses. The former Halcott maintenance supervisor spoke first, then the records clerk from the contracting firm, then Harriet Voss, who had been discharged from Riverside 5 days after the explosion, and who walked to the front of the chamber with a cane she had not needed before, and stood at the microphone with the bearing of someone who had been waiting 30 years for exactly this moment and intended to use it correctly. "I worked at Halcott for 32 years, Harriet said. Her voice was even. "I saw things that were wrong. I said something about the things that were wrong. I was moved to a different department and told I had misread the documents." She paused. "I had not misread the documents. I had read them exactly correctly, and I knew it, and I kept copies because I knew it." Another pause, shorter. "I want everyone in this room to understand that the people who did this did not do it carelessly. They did it deliberately, and they did it because they believed that the risk of being caught was lower than the cost of doing the right thing. They were wrong about that. But they were only wrong about it because of a chain of people who refused, at different points and under different pressures, to let what they knew disappear." She looked at Olivia. "This woman," she said, "heard me when I had been not heard for a very long time. That's not a small thing. I want her to know that." The room was quiet. Olivia looked at Harriet. She nodded once. Not a dismissal, not deflection, but acknowledgement in the fullest sense of the word. "I received what you said. I am holding it." After the hearing, in the corridor outside the chamber, Sasha Barr found her. She was taller than Olivia had pictured, and younger looking in person. 19 carrying itself like 17, the specific undefended quality of someone who had not yet learned to keep their face at a distance from what they were feeling. She stopped a few feet away and looked at Olivia with an expression that was not grief exactly, or not only grief, but something more complicated. "He would have liked you," Sasha said. "My dad. He was the kind of person who, he noticed when other people were being treated unfairly. It made him angry. He couldn't let it go." She stopped. "I couldn't figure out if that was a strength or a problem growing up. Now I think it's a strength." Olivia looked at her for a long moment. She thought about Curtis Barr's maintenance request, about the 14 months between that denied request and the morning the pressure system gave out, about the specific texture of noticing something wrong and writing it down and being told you were wrong and doing it anyway. "It's a strength," Olivia said. "It costs something, but it's a strength." Sasha nodded. She looked like she was storing that somewhere specific. "They're going to put me in contact with the victim advocate's office," she said, "for the civil case." "Yes, that's the right process. Stick with it, even when it's slow." "How do you know when it's worth it?" "The sticking with it." Olivia considered the question honestly, the way it deserved. "You don't always know in advance," she said. "You know looking back. That's not a satisfying answer, but it's the true one." Sasha looked at her. "Harriet said you saved her life. In the ER. I did a procedure she needed. She said you also just sat with her. After. When she told you about my dad in the box." "Yes." "She said that was just as important." Sasha paused. "I believe her." Olivia felt something in her chest that was not simple. Grief and something else. Something that had no clean name. The specific emotional texture of a moment that was simultaneously terrible and exactly right. A moment where the cost of everything was visible and the meaning of everything was also visible, and both of those things were equally true. "Take care of yourself, Sasha," she said. "You too," said Sasha Barr. And she meant it, which Olivia could tell because she was a person who could tell. But, she accepted the position at Riverside 3 weeks later. Not immediately after Hartwell offered it, not after the hearing. She had taken the additional time deliberately, using it to have 4 separate conversations with Hartwell about structural changes, reporting protocols, independent compliance oversight, a whistleblower protection mechanism with teeth, a clinical staffing review. She had come to those conversations with notes, with specific language, with the names of outside consultants she wanted brought in. Hartwell had said yes to all of it, which Olivia did not take as evidence of Hartwell's generosity so much as evidence of a board that understood, with comprehensive clarity, that the alternative to reform was dissolution. The position was Director of Emergency Services. It came with authority over clinical protocols, staff allocation, and the part that mattered most practically, the ability to flag compliance concerns through a direct channel to the independent oversight body that was now a condition of the hospital's continued federal certification. She was not naive about what it meant. She had been in institutions long enough to know that reform was not a destination but a maintenance task, something you had to do continuously and often against friction, and that the people who got worn down by that friction were the people the institutions were counting on getting worn down. She did not intend to get worn down. She had been trained in conditions considerably more demanding than hospital administration. Her first week in the new role, she called Dennis Falk into her office. "I need a charge nurse who will tell me when something is wrong," she said. "Not tell me what I want to hear, not manage upward. Tell me when something is wrong." Falk looked at her. "Is that a job offer?" "It's a conversation about whether you want one." He thought about it for exactly the amount of time a person who had already made up their mind takes to avoid looking like they hadn't thought it through. "Yes," he said. She also called Garrett Solis. Not to offer a position. He was 2 years out of school and not ready for a leadership role, and telling him otherwise would have been a disservice. She called him because he had been in the corridor the morning she was walked out, and he had come to her in the ER afterward and said, "I know." And she wanted him to understand that the arc between those 2 moments, between the silence and the acknowledgement, was something she had noticed, and that it mattered how you handled the space between them. "You didn't say anything when it happened," she said. "No." You said something after. Yes. That gap is where people get lost, she told him. The gap between knowing something is wrong and saying so. The bigger you can make your ability to close that gap, the better you're going to be at this job. She paused. Think about what made the gap that big in the first place. That's worth knowing about yourself. Garrett was quiet for a moment. It was easier to stay out of it. Yes, it usually is, she looked at him. Until it isn't. He nodded slowly. He was going to think about that for a long time. She could see it taking root. The sentencing hearings came in stages over the following year, as these things did. Harlan Voss received a suspended sentence and a permanent revocation of his medical license, which meant he would never practice medicine again. His cooperation had bought him out of prison, but not out of consequence, and he knew it, and the knowing was visible in the way he walked out of the courtroom. Diminished in the specific way of someone who had traded one kind of future for another and was not entirely sure they had made the right calculation. Richard Calvert received 4 years. The judge, in her sentencing remarks, noted that the obstruction charge, the attempted destruction of evidence, added material weight to the final determination, and that the harm resulting from the underlying fraud was not abstract, but specific and documented. 2 deaths and dozens of injuries, and a chain of suppressed safety warnings going back over a decade. Calvert had sat through the sentencing with the same quality of expression he had worn when he told Olivia she had 1 hour to clear her locker. A certain rigid composure, the look of someone who had decided that dignity required the appearance of indifference. The composure broke when the judge said 4 years. It broke briefly and visibly, and then he reassembled it, but the room had seen. Walter Prine's case took 14 months and ended with a guilty plea rather than a trial, the kind of negotiated conclusion that felt anticlimactic from the outside but contained in its specifics, a set of concessions that Reyes told Olivia mattered more than the optics. Prine agreed to full financial restitution to the victims of both the Halcott explosion and the Rashidabad structural collapse. He agreed to a permanent bar from federal contracting. He agreed to 7 years, of which he would serve a minimum of 5. And he agreed to cooperate fully with the identification of any additional facilities that had been cleared under the same falsified inspection process, which led, over the following 8 months, to safety reviews at 6 other sites, 2 of which were found to have critical deficiencies that were corrected before anyone was hurt. 6 sites. Olivia thought about that number. She thought about the maintenance supervisor who had filed his 2020 complaint and been told he was wrong. She thought about the records clerk who had noticed the invoice patterns and then stopped mentioning them. She thought about the question she had written on the back of the folder, how many others? And the answer, which was not a clean number but was real, enough that the correction mattered, enough that the people who had not been heard had, eventually, been the reason that other people were still alive. The ceremony was small, which was how she wanted it. The Army had offered something larger, a formal event at Fort Delmore, dress uniforms, the works. She had declined that and asked for something appropriate to the actual situation, which was the restoration of a record that should never have been altered, not the award of something new. The distinction mattered to her. It happened in a conference room at the OIG field office in Branton on a Tuesday morning in March, 15 months after the explosion. Braun was there. Reyes was there. Colonel Harwick was there, which had been Olivia's specific request, not as a gesture of reconciliation exactly, but because he had been the one to bury it, and it seemed right that he be the one to witness its restoration. Harriet Voss was there still using the cane, and Dennis Falk, and Garrett Solis, and a woman Olivia hadn't expected, Destin Gozi, medically discharged in 2022, who had driven 6 hours from where she lived now in the coastal lowlands because Braun had reached out, and she had said yes without needing to think about it. They read the commendations into the official record. The Rashidabad citation in full, declassified and clean, with the after-action detail now publicly attached. Olivia stood and listened to her own history being read back to her correctly, and the feeling was strange, not triumphant, not the burst of something she'd imagined vindication would feel like when she had imagined it at all. It was quieter than that, more like the sensation of a room returning to its correct temperature after a long time at the wrong one, Not dramatic, just right. Desta crossed the room afterward and hugged her without preamble, the way people hug when they've been through something together that has no adequate language. Olivia let herself receive that without deflecting it, which was something she had been practicing. "You good?" Desta asked. "Working on it," Olivia said. "Same." Desta pulled back and looked at her. "You look tired." "I'm always tired." "But different tired than before." Olivia thought about that. "Yeah," she said. "Different tired." She drove back to Port Sterling that afternoon, and she stopped on the way at a diner she had passed 100 times and never been into, and she ordered coffee and a sandwich, and she sat by the window and watched the highway for a while. The sky was doing something specific, the particular pale blue of early March, when winter hasn't fully released but the light has started coming back, the kind of sky that doesn't make promises but suggests possibilities. She thought about what Harriet Voss had said in the hearing. A chain of people who refused, at different points and under different pressures, to let what they knew disappear. She thought about what that actually looked like from the inside, what it cost. The procurement analyst transferred out of her division. The records clerk who had stopped mentioning things, and then years later agreed to talk to federal investigators anyway. The maintenance supervisor who filed his complaint knowing it would probably cost him something. Harriet, 30 years with a box of documents in her trunk, and the ongoing low-grade weight of knowing and not being heard. None of them had been heroes in the way stories usually described heroes, certain and bold and effective in real time. They had been scared and tired, and sometimes they had gone quiet for months or years before finding another way forward. They had been imperfect and incremental, and they had kept something alive through sheer refusal to fully let go of what they knew was true. That was the thing that didn't get said clearly enough. That the most important acts don't usually look important when they're happening. They look like a flagged medication order. They look like a box of documents kept in a trunk. They look like a supply chain discrepancy written down in a report that gets classified and buried, and then surfaces 4 years later as the first link in a chain that leads somewhere that matters. You don't always see the chain from inside it. You just see the next right thing to do. She finished the coffee. She left a tip that was larger than the bill, because the woman who had refilled her cup twice without being asked had been on her feet since before Olivia arrived and would be on them long after she left, and that deserved acknowledgement. She got back in her car. She drove back to Port Sterling, to the hospital that had fired her and then rehired her, to the floor where she was now the one with the authority to make certain things harder to bury. Not impossible, because nothing was impossible if people were determined enough, but harder, visibly harder, with witnesses and records and a direct line to an independent oversight body that would pick up when she called. It was not a perfect system. She had stopped expecting perfect systems around the same time she stopped expecting perfect days. What she expected now was the ability to do the work, and the standing to do it with, and the knowledge, restored, documented, no longer hidden, of who she was and what she had done and what she was capable of. That was enough. More than enough. It was in the most precise sense she knew how to use the word, sufficient. She parked in the lot, not Space 44, never that one, and walked toward the entrance of Riverside Medical Center in the pale March light, and she thought about Sasha Barr, who was 19 years old and had inherited her father's inability to let go of things that were wrong, and who had texted Olivia 2 weeks ago to say she was thinking about medical school. That gap is where people get lost, Olivia had told Garrett. The gap between knowing something is wrong and saying so. Sasha Barr was going to close that gap. Olivia could feel it. The kind of people who drove their daughters to college in August and told them about the basketball team and filed maintenance requests that got denied and filed them again. Those people left something behind. Not just grief. Something harder and more durable. Olivia pushed through the entrance doors and nodded at the registration desk and took the stairs, the way she always did. Because the elevator was slow and because she had learned a long time ago that the difference between the person you were and the person you were becoming was mostly made up of small choices made repeatedly in the same direction. She had 14 things on her desk. She was going to do all of them. She went to work. Oh, there's a particular kind of person in every institution, in every hospital, every base, every organization that holds power over other people's lives, who sees the thing that is wrong and writes it down, who files the report and waits for the response and gets the wrong one and files it again, who carries the box of documents in the trunk for 30 years, not because they know it will ever matter, but because they cannot make themselves throw it away. That person is rarely celebrated in real time. They are often transferred, reassigned, suspended, fired. They are told they misread the documents. They are told there is nothing actionable. They are told that the risk of speaking is higher than the cost of silence, and sometimes that is even true. But the record survives. The report survives. The box in the trunk survives. And when the chain finally becomes visible, when the links connect and the light comes in, the people who held the knowledge and refused to release it are the reason any of it becomes legible at all. You may never know, in the moment you're holding it, whether what you know will matter. You hold it anyway. That is not naivety. That is the most demanding form of courage there is. It is enough. It has always been enough.